He thought she was just another inexperienced attorney. Judge Arthur Coleman barely glanced up from his papers when Olivia Prescott entered his courtroom. Her presence as unassuming as her wardrobe, a plain beige sweater, no jewelry, scuffed leather shoes, and an old black briefcase that looked more like it belonged to a paralegal than led counsel. "Are you actually prepared to handle this case?" he asked, his voice coated with condescension. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. The elderly plaintiffs behind Olivia looked nervous. The defense team smirked knowingly, but none of them knew what was coming. In just 7 minutes, that same judge would fall silent. He would go from mocking her to asking for her legal opinion in chambers. She was about to dismantle a system that had long judged people not by their arguments, but by their appearances. What happened in those 7 minutes changed the course of that courtroom, and maybe even Judge Coleman's career forever. This isn't just a story about the law. It's a story about perception, power, and what happens when the truth walks into a room in disguise. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us where in the world are you watching from today, and if this story moves you like it moved us. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary morning when Olivia Prescott looked at herself in the mirror and said, quietly, "This has to work." The woman staring back at her was almost unrecognizable from her usual self. Her pearl earrings gone, her signature fitted blazer replaced by a loose, thrifted cardigan. Her perfectly styled curls were now pulled into a modest bun, and even her glasses had been switched for an older, thicker framed pair she hadn't worn since law school. To most, she might have looked like someone fresh out of a legal internship, maybe a public defender assigned last minute. But Olivia Prescott was far from inexperienced. At 38, she had argued before the Supreme Court, authored briefs cited in legal journals, and exposed corruption in housing development practices from Maine to Maryland. But today wasn't about accolades. Today was about strategy. The night before, she had reread the notes on Judge Coleman. He had presided over Suffolk County Court for nearly 15 years and was known for his unyielding courtroom demeanor and subtle, but persistent, bias, particularly against female attorneys. The statistics didn't lie. In 72% of the cases where a woman represented low-income clients against corporate entities, Coleman ruled in favor of the defense. In private circles, people called him the Wall, not because he was immovable on facts, but because once he made up his mind, nothing could change him. Especially not a well-dressed, confident woman quoting legal precedent. Olivia knew if she walked into that courtroom as herself Harvard Law graduate, national civil rights advocate, articulate and polished, Coleman would see her as a challenge to be beaten. But if he saw a struggling, inexperienced lawyer, someone unsure of her footing, he might drop his guard. He might underestimate her. And if there was one thing Olivia had learned in years of litigation, it was this: you don't always win by pushing. Sometimes, you win by pulling back just enough to let the system reveal its own flaws. 3 months earlier, she'd been approached by a small group of residents from Riverside Gardens, a modest retirement community on the outskirts of Boston. The residents were mostly women, mostly black and brown, and mostly widowed or alone. Their homes weren't lavish, but they were safe, affordable, and for many, the only place they had ever truly belonged. That was until Westlake Development came in, with glossy renderings of luxury condominiums and promises of revitalization. Westlake had begun pressuring residents to sign relocation agreements. They filed zoning change petitions with record speed. They paid off city inspectors. They even filed noise complaints to create a record of community disruption. And then they filed for eviction. The first attorney who took the case was a man named Sullivan, a reputable, high-billing lawyer with credentials as glossy as his resume. He lasted one hearing before Coleman shredded him apart on technicalities and ruled the initial eviction attempt valid. The residents were desperate. Gloria Winters, 78, had called Olivia after reading about her in a housing discrimination case from the year before. "You're the only one they seem to listen to," she had said, "but we can't afford much. We just need someone to care." Olivia remembered staring at the phone for a long moment before answering. "I care. Now." Standing in that courtroom, The weight of those words echoed back to her. She adjusted her glasses as she opened her file, deliberately fumbling a little, allowing her hands to shake just slightly enough for Coleman to notice. He did. "Let's hope we don't waste the court's time today," he muttered, voice dry, leaning back with the practiced disdain of someone who'd already made his ruling. She nodded respectfully. "Understood, Your Honor." Richard Daniels, Westlake's lead attorney, stood confidently, tailored suit, cufflinks that caught the sunlight, and a rehearsed smile designed for winning. He glanced at Olivia, smirked, and then addressed the court with the calm precision of someone used to getting his way. "Your Honor, Westlake Development has followed all proper protocols. The zoning approval was granted by the City Council. The land in question no longer meets economic viability under current residential use. The transition to commercial development is not only legal, it's inevitable." Olivia remained quiet. She wanted Daniels to think she was outmatched. She wanted Coleman to think this would be easy. "Miss Prescott," the judge said, finally turning his full attention toward her. "Your response?" She rose, keeping her posture slightly hunched, her voice calm but unassuming. "Yes, Your Honor. We believe there were irregularities in how the zoning change was communicated to residents. Many never received proper notice." Coleman sighed loudly. "You have documentation. We have affidavits signed by multiple tenants. Affidavits can be written by anyone." Coleman snapped. Daniels laughed quietly behind his hand. Coleman didn't stop him. Olivia lowered her eyes as if flustered. "We also have concerns about the historical value of the property. This isn't a history museum." Coleman interrupted. "You said you were prepared. So far, I'm not seeing much preparation." For a brief moment, silence fell over the room. Olivia could feel the tension in the air, the quiet sting of humiliation, the subtle shift in the audience as people began to write her off. But this was the moment she had planned for. Gloria, seated behind her, leaned forward and whispered, "Are you okay?" Olivia smiled without turning. "It's working." She faced the judge again. "Your Honor, may I have a moment to consult with my clients?" Coleman waved her off. "Fine, make it quick, then I'll be ruling." She turned her back to him, leaned toward Gloria and the others, and whispered, "Get ready." Gloria looked confused. For what, Olivia stood up straight, straighter than she had all morning. She squared her shoulders, her eyes locking with the judge's. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still soft but steadier, "before your ruling, I'd like to raise a matter regarding Docket 62B, specifically the municipal code around properties housing elderly tenants for 20-plus years." Coleman frowned. "We've already discussed zoning, not zoning. Your Honor, historical preservation eligibility, based on Williams B's Northeastern Development, Third Circuit, 2008. And just like that, the tone of the room shifted. Coleman blinked. Daniels froze. And the quiet woman in the beige sweater began to reveal who she really was. There was a pause. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that tilts the axis of a room, a courtroom usually built on routine, on rhythm, suddenly held its breath. Olivia Prescott stood a little taller now, not by much. Just enough. Just enough for the judge to notice that the woman he thought was fumbling her way through her first real case had just cited a precedent he hadn't heard referenced in over a decade. Williams for B's Northeastern Development? She repeated calmly, as if to herself, but loud enough for the room to catch. Third Circuit, 2008. The court ruled that residential properties housing a majority elderly population for over 20 years may qualify for expedited historical review under municipal preservation law, even without prior designation. Judge Coleman adjusted his glasses, trying to mask the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Daniels, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably. He leaned in to whisper something to his associate, who began frantically typing into a laptop. Olivia, now at the center of gravity in the room, did not press forward too quickly. She let the silence stretch, the tension deepen. This was part of her method. Let the weight of her knowledge reveal itself. One layer at a time, like sediment rising from still water. "I've prepared a brief on the Williams case. Your Honor," she continued, along with 3 subsequent cases that reinforce its applicability to elder housing developments throughout New England. She retrieved a stapled document from her weathered briefcase and approached the bench with careful, deliberate steps. She didn't move like someone in a hurry to prove herself anymore. She moved like someone certain of her destination. Judge Coleman took the packet, his brow furrowed. He flipped the first page slowly, not out of disinterest, but because he was already scanning for the part where the argument might unravel. Olivia stepped back to her table and clasped her hands loosely in front of her. She could feel the shift in the room, not overt, but undeniable. The gallery, once restless, had grown still. Even the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had started listening. "Miss Prescott," the judge said finally, without looking up, "you seem surprisingly familiar with housing preservation law. I find it's an often overlooked facet of property litigation." "Your Honor," she replied modestly, "but one that tends to come alive in cases like this." Daniels rose. His voice was tight but measured. "Your Honor, the Williams case pertains to Pennsylvania statutes. Its relevance to Massachusetts zoning law is tenuous at best." Olivia didn't even glance in his direction. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge. "That would be true, Mr. Daniels, except that the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court cited Williams favorably just last year in Geller Fisher's Boston Housing Authority. Page 47 of the ruling extends the principle to all New England states through precedent." Daniels froze. He turned to his associate, who had stopped typing and was now staring at the screen with a tight-lipped expression. Judge Coleman flipped to the page Olivia had referenced. He found the citation in seconds. The shift was complete now. Coleman leaned back in his chair, his eyes finally meeting Olivia's, not with scorn or impatience, but with something closer to curiosity. "And you're telling me Riverside Gardens meets the criteria?" "Yes, Your Honor," Olivia replied. "All 5 criteria. In fact, I've included a chart summarizing the qualifying elements: demographics, duration of occupancy, architectural significance, community function, and vulnerability of displacement." She handed over another set of papers. Behind her, Gloria Winters straightened in her seat. She wasn't sure what had just happened, only that the woman she and her neighbors had put their last shred of hope into had just turned the entire courtroom's energy inside out. Daniels cut in again. "Your Honor, we'd request a brief recess to review these materials." Coleman didn't answer immediately. He was still scanning the chart. His fingers drummed lightly against the wood of his bench. An unconscious tick that Olivia noted and filed away her years in the courtroom had taught her how to read not just voices, but bodies. A flick of the wrist, a tap of a pen, a pause too long or too short. Language lived everywhere. 15 minutes. The judge said at last, "Miss Prescott." "Mr. Daniels in chambers." There was an audible exhale in the gallery. People rarely got called into chambers mid-hearing. It meant something had shifted, something unexpected. As she gathered her papers, Olivia could hear whispers from the back row. "Who is she? Where did she come from?" One elderly man leaned toward Gloria and whispered, "I thought she was just a legal aid or something." Gloria just smiled, not saying a word. In the judge's chambers, Coleman closed the door behind them. The wood-paneled room was smaller than Olivia expected, intimate and suffocating. A single lamp cast a warm glow over an antique desk piled with paper, plaques, and legal tomes. Coleman didn't sit right away. Instead, he looked at Olivia carefully, no longer trying to size her down, but trying to make sense of her. "Mr. Daniels," the judge said, voice neutral, "were you aware of the Geller citation?" Daniels stiffened. "We examined the ruling. Your Honor, we found the circumstances distinguishable from the current matter." "Distinguished how?" Coleman asked sharply. "Miss Prescott's analysis seems thorough." Daniels fumbled. "The covenant issue, the age of the structures, the demographic spread all addressed," Olivia said calmly. "In section 3 of my brief," Coleman turned to her, "you cited Professor Abernathy in footnote 6, yeah?" She replied, "His comparative study on preservation statutes, published in Harvard Law Review." The judge blinked, then crossed his arms. "You've read Abernathy. I've taught his work," she said, her voice even. During my guest lectures at Suffolk and once at Yale, that got his full attention. And where did you study law, he asked. Harvard, class of 2008. Daniels looked genuinely stunned now. You're that Olivia Prescott. Coleman's eyes narrowed. You argued Prescott v. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I did. The room went silent again. The walls were closer now, the air tighter. That case, Coleman muttered, rewrote fair housing enforcement. Yes, Your Honor. She said, it did. Coleman turned, walking slowly to his desk. Why didn't you present yourself as you are? I did, Olivia said, her voice softening. I just didn't present myself the way people expect someone like me to look. The judge stared at her for a moment, then gave a single nod, slow, almost reluctant. Let's return to court. Back in the courtroom. The atmosphere had changed completely. Coleman's tone was no longer clipped, no longer dismissive. Olivia spoke with a quiet confidence now, her voice no longer suppressed but still never boastful. Daniels looked shaken. His team shuffled papers nervously, no longer smirking. As Olivia laid out the final elements of her argument, she felt the room leaning in, not just listening, but hearing her. Not because she raised her voice or dramatized her words, but because the structure of truth was too well built to ignore. And finally, when she held up the original community charter from 1972, a document no one else in the room had even known existed, she could see it in Coleman's eyes. The realization that this case had never been about appearances. It had always been about the law. But the law, like people, sometimes needed to be reminded to look again. And this time, it saw everything. The murmurs hadn't stopped since they returned to the courtroom. Every seat in the gallery was filled now, and the hallway outside had gathered its own audience, young interns sneaking glances through the doorframe, a local reporter with a notepad in her lap pretending to be an observer, and even two off-duty public defenders leaning against the wall, eyes wide, exchanging whispers like school children witnessing a legend in real life. Olivia didn't let any of it reach her. She had tuned out the noise long ago, trained herself to live in the narrow space between distraction and decision. What mattered now wasn't the spectacle or even the shift in the judge's demeanor. What mattered was the law, the fragile weight of it, and how close it had come to being ignored simply because of the way she looked when she walked in that morning. Judge Coleman cleared his throat, and the room quieted instantly. We'll continue, he said, his tone notably less gruff. Miss Prescott, you may proceed with any additional documentation. Olivia gave a small nod. Her movements were precise now, no longer tinged with hesitation. She reached into her briefcase and retrieved a weathered folder, sliding it open to reveal the final set of documents she had prepared. Your Honor, I would like to enter Exhibit C into the record, she said, her voice steady, the original community charter for Riverside Gardens, established in 1972. Coleman gestured for the clerk to collect the document. As she handed it over, Daniel stood abruptly. We object, he announced, tone sharp. This was not submitted during the discovery. Olivia didn't turn. She had anticipated this exact move. It was included. She replied calmly. In the second production set, as an attachment to our March 15th filing, page 147, subsection B, Daniels froze. One of his junior associates frantically began flipping through a thick binder. A moment later, the young man leaned up and whispered something. Daniels' jaw tightened. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Daniels hesitated. It appears it was included. Your Honor, Coleman gave a tight nod and turned his attention to the document in his hand. He flipped the first few pages with deliberate slowness, then paused as he reached a handwritten addendum near the back. This covenant, he said aloud, explicitly prohibits commercial development for spouse for a period of 50 years, provided the units remain occupied by low-income or elderly residents. Olivia didn't move. Coleman continued reading. It was recorded with the county clerk's office and notarized. Daniels tried to recover. That clause, Your Honor, is outdated. Zoning adjustments made in the past year would override that agreement. Olivia finally looked at him. Under normal circumstances, perhaps, but in Latimer Crescent Development, 2019, The Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that original property deeds bearing restrictive covenants remain enforceable, especially when those covenants were part of the initial recorded sale. She stepped forward slightly. Furthermore, the Latimer decision clarified that zoning changes cannot retroactively nullify deed-based limitations without a judicial review. The judge blinked, slowly. He turned to Daniels. You were aware of Latimer. I assume Daniels didn't answer. His expression was imploding under the weight of suppressed embarrassment. Olivia could feel it in the air. The balance of the room had shifted again. Not in bursts, not in dramatic gasps or visible reactions, but in quiet things that change in Coleman's posture. The increasing rustle of legal pads being flipped open in the gallery, the sudden attentiveness of attorneys who'd once sat back disinterested. Behind her, she felt the warmth of Gloria's hand reaching out, resting gently on her shoulder. Olivia didn't turn, but that touch, the affirmation in it, carried more than any applause could have. She inhaled once, then continued. I've also included in this binder a list of similar preservation cases, she said, each one demonstrating how vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly, face systemic displacement through fast-tracked rezoning efforts. Cases where courts intervene to preserve not just the property, but the community. Judge Coleman was no longer flipping through pages out of courtesy. He was reading them, following along, annotating. Miss Prescott, he said after a moment, not looking up. You mentioned you relocated recently. What brought you to this case in particular? It was an unorthodox question, personal, and asked in open court, but Olivia understood the meaning beneath it. He wanted to know why someone like her, accomplished, high profile, recognized in national law circles, would take on a case like this and come into his courtroom dressed as if she hadn't won a thing in her life. I believe, she began, voice lower now, but no less certain, that the law isn't just a tool for those who can afford it. It's a shield, and sometimes that shield is rusted or forgotten. Sometimes, the only way to make people see it again is to hold it up quietly, patiently, and wait for the light to catch. She paused, then added, and because no one else would. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, meaningful, and for the first time in that courtroom, Judge Coleman looked not just at her, but into her. Daniels stood again, clearly desperate to pivot. Your Honor, even if these arguments stand, the financial cost to my client is substantial. Delaying this development further could result in losses of several $1,000,000. Olivia turned toward him, her tone sharper now, controlled, but edged. The law doesn't bend for the highest bidder. Mr. Daniels, it protects those who cannot afford to protect themselves. Coleman leaned back, temple resting against his knuckles. Then, after a moment, he straightened. Miss Prescott, he said, you've presented a remarkably thorough case. One might wonder why the understated presentation at the outset. Olivia met his gaze. There was no smugness, only quiet resolve. I've found that when people expect less of you, they listen less. But when they realize they've misjudged you, then they really start paying attention. Another pause. Coleman nodded once. Well, he said, glancing toward the court reporter, I believe we've heard enough for today. He tapped his gavel gently. This court is issuing a temporary injunction against Westlake Development's plans to proceed with eviction. A full review of the zoning and covenant documents will be scheduled. The gallery broke into a low wave of wisps and relieved murmurs. Gloria clutched Olivia's hand tightly now, her eyes gleaming with tears. But Olivia didn't smile, not yet, not until Coleman added, and this court formally recognizes the covenant as valid pending further verification. The rights of the residents remain in full effect. Now she smiled. Outside, as they stepped into the soft sunlight pouring over the courthouse steps, the crowd was waiting. Reporters, passers-by, lawyers from other cases. Someone shouted her name. Miss Prescott, did you really disguise yourself to expose bias? She didn't answer right away. Gloria leaned into her and whispered, you didn't just save our homes. You made them see us. Olivia looked up at the sea of microphones, cameras, and wide eyes. She felt no urge to perform, no temptation to claim victory. I presented the law. she said simply, and this time it was finally heard. As they walked down the steps, she glanced over her shoulder just once. Judge Coleman stood near the top of the steps, watching quietly, arms behind his back. He didn't say anything, but his expression said enough. Recognition, respect, and perhaps the beginning of change. Rain had started to fall in a soft, hesitant drizzle as Olivia stepped off the courthouse steps. The wind caught the edges of her sweater, lifting them slightly like a curtain about to reveal something behind it. Around her, the crowd of onlookers began to disperse, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering, still digesting what had just happened inside. A few reporters continued calling after her, but she said nothing more. Not yet. Her words had done enough for one day. Beside her, Gloria clutched her small leather handbag close to her chest and walked slowly, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. "You didn't just argue," she murmured, voice thick with emotion. You dismantled him." Olivia offered a gentle smile but kept her eyes ahead. "No," she said. "I just let him see what was already there." They turned onto a quieter street, heading toward the car waiting for the residents. As they walked, Gloria chuckled softly. "I hope someone got that on tape." Olivia's smile widened just slightly. They always do. By the time she reached her own car, a modest hybrid parked 4 blocks away, to avoid attention, the rain had become steadier. She slipped inside, letting the silence settle around her. For the first time in hours, she exhaled, not the controlled breaths she'd taken in court, but a full, tired release. Her hands gripped the steering wheel. They were trembling slightly. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the courtroom was ebbing now, leaving behind the familiar quiet of fatigue. She sat there for a long minute, watching droplets form on the windshield. Her reflection stared back at her in the mirror, hair damp, glasses fogged, sweater clinging to her shoulders, and beneath it all, a simmering kind of fire still burned in her chest. Back at her apartment, the space welcomed her with the kind of silence only a person who lives alone can understand. Books lined every surface. Legal journals were stacked in quiet towers beside the couch. Her cat, Maya, meowed once in protest at the late hour and promptly returned to her perch on the windowsill. Olivia toed off her shoes, peeled off the rain-heavy sweater, and let it fall over the back of a chair. Then she walked straight into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. No wine, no celebration, just clarity. She stood there in the kitchen, still holding the glass, when her phone buzzed. A message from Marcus, her former law partner. "Holy hell, you're trending on Twitter." Again, a second message followed almost immediately. "Someone leaked the clip of Coleman asking you about Abernathy. It's got 30K views already. You okay?" Olivia didn't answer right away. She stared at the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, the cold condensation from the glass running down her fingers. Then she typed, "He finally listened. That's enough for now." But it wasn't enough. Not really. The next morning, Olivia woke up early. She wasn't due in court again until Friday. But her mind refused rest. She spent the morning reviewing follow-up documentation from Riverside Gardens, drafting a motion to secure longer-term protections under historical preservation laws. Then she made 2 phone calls, one to a sympathetic city councilwoman who had quietly supported the tenants, and another to a journalist she trusted, someone who understood nuance, not just headlines. By noon, she was already back in her modest office space in a shared legal suite downtown, sorting files into case binders. A knock at her door interrupted her rhythm. It was Diane, a junior attorney from down the hall. "Prescott," Diane said, slightly breathless. "You've got someone waiting for you. Says he's from the state bar." Olivia frowned slightly. "Did he say what it's regarding?" Diane shrugged. "Didn't sound hostile, just intense." When Olivia stepped into the small waiting area, the man stood immediately, tall, dark suit, neatly combed salt and pepper hair, the kind of man who looked like he still used a fountain pen and knew every footnote in a legal brief by heart. "Miss Prescott," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Terrence Blake. I serve on the Judicial Ethics Oversight Committee." That gave her pause. All right, she replied cautiously, shaking his hand. What brings you here? I watched your hearing yesterday, he said, and I've reviewed the transcript. Olivia's spine straightened. I'm not here to investigate you, he added quickly, seeing the shift in her posture, and I'm here because what you exposed, it wasn't just bias. It was systemic oversight, and we'd like to speak with you about possibly joining a review panel on judicial conduct. Olivia blinked. I'm not sure I understand. Blake lowered his voice. You walked into that courtroom and showed us live, in real time, how subtle bias doesn't always wear a white hood or speak with a snarl. Sometimes it wears a robe and asks if you're the paralegal. His words hung in the air. We need that perspective, he said, from someone who knows both how to fight and how to reveal, without rage, without spectacle, just truth. Olivia studied him. I don't take those invitations lightly. I know, he said, but think about it. The panel's not public, not political. We review patterns, complaints, behavior, and we make recommendations before damage becomes scandal. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't say no either. After he left, Olivia sat at her desk, fingers laced together, thoughts spiraling. The offer felt too soon, too clean, and yet, hadn't she always known that the courtroom wasn't the only battlefield? That sometimes the war wasn't about one case, one ruling, but about the lens through which justice was applied. Her thoughts were interrupted by another buzz, an alert on her news app. Judge Arthur Coleman issues public statement acknowledging judicial assumptions in recent housing case. She clicked the article. I allowed myself to form an impression based on appearance rather than argument, the judge had said, and while no ruling was based solely on such assumptions, the fact that I was forced to confront them in myself is enough to warrant reflection. He hadn't named her. He hadn't needed to. That afternoon, Olivia returned to Riverside Gardens. The residents were gathered in the community center, sipping tea and speaking in low voices. When she walked in, every head turned. Gloria rose and crossed the room slowly. We've been watching the news, she said softly. We saw the judge's statement. Olivia nodded. It's not a victory. Not yet. Gloria smiled gently. No, but it's a beginning. Around her, others came forward. Some offered cookies. Others just held her hand. They didn't talk about the law. They talked about what it felt like to be heard after years of shouting into silence. As the sun dipped low and cast a golden hue across the brick walls of Riverside Gardens, Olivia stood by the window and watched two residents tending to a small garden patch, knees in the soil, hands deep in the earth, replanting marigolds. Justice, she thought, didn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes. It looked like this, quiet, patient, rooted. It started with a voicemail. Olivia didn't hear until hours after it had been left. The timestamp read 6:12 EUM. The voice clipped an official belonged to a clerk from the Suffolk County Superior Court. Miss Prescott, this is an urgent notice. A motion has been filed this morning requesting the immediate lift of the injunction granted yesterday in the matter of Riverside Gardens. The motion includes an emergency claim regarding public safety and infrastructure violations. Judge Coleman has scheduled an emergency hearing for 4 p.m. today. Please confirm receipt. Olivia stood in the middle of her apartment, the early afternoon sun spilling in through the blinds, her laptop open and untouched on the kitchen counter. She listened to the message again, then once more, slower, as if the tone might offer a clue that the words had not. It didn't make sense. There was no known basis for such a motion. The injunction had been clear, the legal arguments robust, and the precedent well established. Public safety infrastructure. It was a deflection tactic, a last-ditch effort to claw back the narrative. She immediately called the clerk's office to confirm. Yes, Miss Prescott, the voice on the other end said. The motion was filed by Westlake's legal team. They're citing an anonymous inspection report and an urgent review from the Department of Buildings, something about foundational instability and rodent infestation. Olivia felt the flicker of anger rise through her ribs. It was a tactic she'd seen before weaponized bureaucracy. If they couldn't beat the law, they'd try to bury the facts under new paperwork, Manufacturer crisis. Claimed the building was too far gone to preserve. But it wasn't just a legal ploy. It was personal. It was desperation. She had less than 3 hours to prepare. By the time she reached her office, Marcus was already waiting, coffee in hand, laptop open. He greeted her with a single raised eyebrow. "They're going nuclear," he said. "I heard. They pulled in a private inspection team. Hired this guy out of New Hampshire on Westlake's payroll for the last 2 years. He's not officially connected to the city, but the report has a stamp that looks official enough to scare most judges." Olivia scanned the screen. The report was filled with vague but frightening language: serious deterioration, potential for collapse, public hazard. It was textbook fear-mongering. "They're claiming the building poses an immediate risk to surrounding properties," Marcus said. "That delaying redevelopment puts residents and neighboring buildings in danger." Olivia sighed and dropped her briefcase on the desk. "Have you pulled the official inspection reports from the past year?" "Already did. Last city inspection was 4 months ago. Building passed with only minor code violations, cracked tiling, rusted stair rail, nothing structural. I cross-referenced the inspector's badge number with the city database." "It's all legit." "Good," Olivia said. "I want those documents printed, highlighted, and filed as Exhibit D." Marcus hesitated. "You think Coleman's going to buy their argument?" "He won't want to," she said. "But if there's even a shadow of public endangerment, he'll have to take it seriously. It gives him political cover to reverse course. Unless we can prove it's a smokescreen, we don't need to prove intent," she said, already pulling out her laptop. "We need to show inconsistency, discredit the source, establish a pattern, find cases where this inspector's testimony has been overturned or questioned." Marcus nodded and turned back to his screen, fingers flying. As the clock ticked toward 4, Olivia reviewed the case file one last time. Her reflection in the window caught her eye. Same glasses, same bun, same muted clothing. But the woman looking back wasn't trying to hide anymore. There was no disguise left. This time, she would stand before Coleman not to provoke his assumptions, but to test the limits of his growth. When she walked into the courtroom that afternoon, the gallery was thinner than the day before, but the energy was no less charged. A few residents had made their way in Gloria among them, clutching umbrellas and worn tote bags. Daniel sat smugly at his table, flanked by 2 new attorneys she didn't recognize. Reinforcements. Coleman entered a few moments later, the shuffle of his robe brushing against the bench. He glanced briefly at both sides before speaking. "We're here for an emergency hearing requested by the defense in the matter of Riverside Gardens. Mr. Daniels." "Proceed." Daniels rose smoothly, voice laced with concern. "Your Honor, new information has come to our attention that changes the scope of this case. An independent inspection, conducted just this week, has revealed significant structural instability within the buildings currently occupied by residents. Additionally, there are indications of a rodent infestation that could pose a health risk." Olivia kept her face unreadable. Daniels continued. "Given these conditions, Westlake believes the injunction delaying redevelopment endangers not just the residents of Riverside Gardens, but also the neighboring properties. We request that the injunction be lifted immediately so that necessary demolition and reconstruction can begin to protect the public." Coleman nodded once, then turned to Olivia. "Miss Prescott," she stood, calm, direct, the rhythm of truth building in her voice. "Your Honor, we acknowledge the seriousness of any claim regarding public safety. However, we also recognize the difference between an emergency and an excuse. The inspection presented by the defense was conducted by a private contractor with direct financial ties to Westlake Development." She stepped forward, holding up a manila folder. "We submit as Exhibit D the most recent city inspection report, conducted by a licensed municipal inspector with no conflicts of interest. That report found only minor code issues, none structural. The same inspector has since confirmed, via sworn affidavit, that there was no indication of collapse risk or vermin infestation." She handed the document to the clerk. "And while the defense's report uses language designed to alarm," she continued, "it offers no concrete metrics, no dated photographs, no engineer's signature. It's speculation wrapped in official formatting." She let that land, Coleman flipped through the city report slowly. Olivia turned toward Daniels. Furthermore, Your Honor, we've compiled a list of 3 previous court cases in which this same inspector's testimony was questioned due to unverifiable data and undisclosed payments. One such case, Maddox First, Hanover Lofts, resulted in a mistrial after evidence surfaced that the inspector's findings were ghostwritten by Hanover's in-house counsel. Daniel stood quickly. That has no relevance here. It has every relevance, Olivia said, her tone rising. Because once again, we are watching a corporation attempt to displace elderly residents through a backdoor campaign of misinformation and fear. And they are doing it with the aid of contractors who wear the appearance of authority but have none of its integrity. The room was still. Coleman tapped his pen against the bench. Miss Prescott, I'll need a few minutes to review this. Recess for 15. When he returned, his face was unreadable. This court finds that the defense's inspection report lacks sufficient credibility or independent verification to justify lifting the injunction at this time. Gloria gasped softly behind Olivia. Furthermore, Coleman continued, we are referring the conduct of the inspection and its authorship to the state licensing board for review. Any further attempt to manipulate procedural rulings with unsupported claims will be met with sanctions. Daniel sat down hard, eyes down. Olivia felt the weight lift not just from her shoulders, but from the room itself. Coleman turned to her. Miss Prescott, he said, voice firm but with something else beneath it now, something close to respect. You may continue your preparations for trial, and thank you for your clarity today. She inclined her head. Thank you, Your Honor. As the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Olivia turned to Gloria. The older woman was crying now, silently, her hand on her chest. They almost took it from us, she whispered. They almost did. Olivia reached for her hand, but they didn't. Outside, the rain had stopped, the clouds had thinned, and somewhere far above, the light had begun to break through. Not a flood, not yet, but enough. The morning after the emergency hearing, Olivia arrived at her office earlier than usual. The hallway lights still flickered lazily, and most of the other suites remained dark. A legal pad clutched in her hand. She paced slowly around her desk, retracing every detail of the last 48 hours. She had won a battle. Yes, but something didn't sit right. Westlake had moved too fast, too precisely, with a kind of desperation that spoke of more than just corporate ambition. There was something else, something they didn't want seen. She poured herself a cup of coffee, still black and bitter from yesterday's pot, and sat down to review the building permits again. The redevelopment paperwork Westlake had filed with the city 6 months ago was oddly incomplete. Several lines were left blank. Others used broad language where specific codes should have been listed. It wasn't just laziness, it was calculated vagueness. And then there was the Stamp City Approval Office, 14B. She stared at it. Something about it tugged at her memory. She logged into the city's public database and ran a search for other permits filed through Office 14B. Only 7 appeared in the last 3 years. 5 of them were connected to Westlake Development. 2 were affiliated with a different developer, Bellamy Estates. But that name rang a bell too, and not in a good way. She kept digging. 45 minutes later, her eyes landed on a case summary from 18 months ago. Bellamy Estates had forced out a cluster of immigrant families from a century-old building in East Boston. The tenants were given 10 days' notice to vacate after a sudden condemnation ruling, allegedly based on emergency infrastructure concerns. The inspector in that case, same as Westlake's anonymous inspector, Harlan Vance. She leaned back in her chair. This wasn't an isolated play. It was a pattern, and that meant Westlake was replicating a strategy, possibly with help inside city departments. She called Marcus. I need everything we can find on Vance in Office 14B, she said without greeting. His licensing background, complaint history, disciplinary actions, and cross-reference any housing development permits from the past 5 years that moved through that office. Got it, Marcus replied. You think there's internal corruption? I think we're staring right at it. By noon, Marcus had pulled together a dossier of flagged transactions. Vance's inspector ID was linked to 11 properties deemed hazardous within 48 hours of rezoning requests. In each case, the property had been sold or transferred to a development firm within 6 weeks. 5 of those firms were directly tied to Westlake via shell companies. Another 3 to Bellamy Estates. The pattern was unmistakable. Most of these were low-income communities. Marcus added, none of the tenants had legal counsel strong enough to fight it. They were counting on that. Olivia murmured, are you going to file criminal charges? Not yet, she said, thumbing through the pages. Not until I have something they can't wriggle out of. These documents show a pattern, but no smoking gun. Well, Marcus said, reaching into his bag. Maybe this is it. He placed a manila envelope on the table. Olivia opened it slowly. Inside was a printed email chain between a city official named Randall Pierce and someone using an encrypted address that matched a Westlake internal server. Push this through quietly. We don't need another press situation. Vance is already prepped. Olivia stared at the page. Where did you get this? A friend in the mayor's office. Marcus said, trusted source. Off the record. Of course. She stood abruptly, pacing the room. We've got collusion between a city department and a private developer. This isn't just unethical. It's illegal. And you just forced Coleman to call it all into open court. Marcus added. Olivia stopped pacing. Her mind moved ahead 3 steps. They were going to try and silence this before it gets traction. Then we go public. Marcus asked, no. Olivia said, not yet. If we go public now, it becomes a media spectacle. Coleman will close ranks. The city will say they need to review internally. The whole thing dies in red tape. We bring it to court. We make it part of the Riverside case, force them to answer under oath. And if Coleman pushes back, then we show him the same thing we showed the world the truth. That afternoon, Olivia filed a motion to compel discovery on the city's zoning department, specifically Office 14B. She attached the email as Exhibit E and included a supporting affidavit from the mayor's aide who had leaked it anonymously. But under penalty of perjury, the motion sent ripples through the courthouse. Whispers followed her into the elevator. And for the first time since she'd begun this case, the clerks didn't avoid her gaze. They met it, wary but intrigued. The following morning, Judge Coleman summoned both parties to his chambers. He didn't waste time. Miss Prescott, he said, standing at his window, hands clasped behind his back, you've just implicated a branch of our city government in an ongoing case. I haven't implicated, she said calmly. I've requested clarification. He turned to her slowly. This kind of motion has consequences. Political ones, institutional ones. I'm aware. Then tell me, he asked, voice measured but sharp. What's your aim here? Is it still about the residents, or is this now about headlines? Olivia met his gaze evenly. It's always been about the residents, Your Honor. But if the system built to protect them is part of the threat, then my duty is to expose that too. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Coleman exhaled and nodded once. Motion granted, limited discovery permitted. But tread carefully, Miss Prescott. You're not just litigating a case anymore. You're standing at the edge of something bigger. I know, she said quietly. The documents came in slow at first, carefully redacted, heavily footnoted, but the deeper they looked, the clearer the scheme became. Olivia and Marcus mapped out the connections' emails, payment trails, timelines. Westlake had effectively created a pipeline of displacement: target, inspect, condemn, acquire, develop, and the city had, whether willfully or not, enabled them. In one email, a staffer joked, another one bites the dust, make room for condos. It was all the proof Olivia needed. By the end of the week, she stood before Judge Coleman once more. The courtroom was packed now. Journalists, attorneys, housing advocates, even the mayor's office had sent a legal observer. Your Honor, Olivia began. We have uncovered a pattern of coordinated effort between a public department and private interests. This isn't about one building. This is about a model of development that disregards the law and destroys communities. And it ends now. She submitted the final set of exhibits, her voice unwavering. I'm requesting that the court not only uphold the injunction, but expand it to include an investigation into the permitting process itself. The residents of Riverside Gardens deserve more than protection. They deserve justice. Coleman said nothing for a long time. Then he leaned forward. Miss Prescott, he said slowly, this court was skeptical of you once. I judged too quickly, and I've seen what that caused. He glanced around the courtroom. Let the record show. He said clearly, this court finds merit in the plaintiff's request. Injunction remains. Further action on permitting and procedural integrity will be referred to the State Attorney General's office for investigation. Olivia didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But behind her, Gloria began to cry. The kind of cry that only comes when years of silence are finally broken. The kind of cry that sounds like freedom, but grieves. The days that followed were unlike anything Olivia had ever experienced, not during her time at Harvard, not even after her Supreme Court appearance. This was different. This wasn't just law. This was movement. It started with the local news. A brief mention during the evening broadcast, attorney Olivia Prescott uncovers potential collusion between city zoning office and major developer calls for statewide investigation. The clip showed her walking briskly out of the courthouse, face composed, surrounded by reporters. She hadn't spoken that day, not yet. She wanted the documents to speak first, but then came the op-eds, then the morning radio spots, then national outlets. By Friday, she was trending on social media again, not for the courtroom theatrics people love to circulate, but because she had quietly, methodically cracked open a system most people didn't even know existed. A lawyer with no entourage, no PR team, no political ambitions, just a briefcase, a case file, and a voice that refused to yield. That weekend, residents from Riverside Gardens hosted a community gathering, not a rally, not a protest, just tables with lemonade, folding chairs, and hand-painted signs that said, "Still home and thank you." Olivia, she hadn't planned on attending. It felt too soon, too performative, but Gloria insisted. "They need to see you," she said over the phone, her voice warm and maternal, not as a lawyer, as the person who showed up when no one else did. So Olivia went. She didn't wear a suit. She didn't bring her laptop. She showed up in jeans, her sleeves rolled up, and helped carry folding chairs from one end of the lawn to the other. Children ran through sprinklers. Neighbors passed around plates of food, and someone played an old soul playlist from a Bluetooth speaker. At one point, a young woman approached her, barely 22, with a notebook clutched to her chest. She introduced herself as Karina, a law student at Northeastern. "I want to do what you do," she said, eyes bright. "Not just the legal stuff, the real stuff." Olivia smiled. "Then don't wait until someone gives you permission. Just start." Karina grinned. Would you ever mentor someone?" Olivia hesitated, but then nodded. "I'd be honored." The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet joy, the kind that settles over a space like soft fog, and for the first time in a long time, Olivia allowed herself to sit still, to let the moment in, but even as she did, a small weight pressed into the back of her mind, a feeling that the storm wasn't entirely over. That feeling proved right by Monday morning. She arrived at her office early again, only to find Marcus standing in her doorway with a grim expression. "We've got a problem," he said. "What kind of problem?" He handed her a manila envelope. Inside was a printed email from a city council liaison. An anonymous source claimed Olivia had coached the city whistleblower into leaking documents. The email alleged misconduct, manipulation, and a violation of attorney conduct rules. There was no name attached, just language dripping in vague accusations and political maneuvering. "They're trying to paint you as a manipulator," Marcus said. "Someone who staged this entire investigation to raise your profile." Olivia exhaled slowly, fingers tightening around the envelope. "Who sent this?" "No one knows. It was leaked to the mayor's office and a few local blogs. It hasn't gone public yet." Olivia paced the room, her mind racing. "They want to discredit me before the investigation gains traction, and they're playing the long game," Marcus added. "If they can raise enough doubt, they can bury the process in oversight hearings. Turn the focus on you instead of Westlake." She stopped. Then we don't give them time. We get ahead of it. How we go back to court that afternoon. Olivia filed a motion requesting full transparency of the permitting trail for all Westlake developments in the city for the last 5 years. Not just Riverside. She attached a statement of her own, refuting the anonymous allegations, and voluntarily submitted to an ethics review panel. She included a declaration from the whistleblower, reaffirming that no coercion took place and that the documents were leaked out of conscience, not persuasion. The press got wind of it within hours. Attorney under fire pushes for deeper probe into Westlake's citywide deals. Prescott doubles down. I don't hide from the truth. I bring it with me. And with that, public support surged again. Legal clinics began holding Prescott forums to teach young attorneys how to challenge systemic abuse. Students wrote essays about her. Professors debated her tactics. And through it all, Olivia remained steady, but the attention came with pressure. Her voicemail filled with interview requests. Her inbox was flooded with nonprofit offers, board positions, even a few whispers about a run for office. Every call, every email, every invitation seemed to say the same thing. Now that you've disrupted the system, come lead it. But Olivia wasn't sure she wanted to. One night, she sat alone in her apartment, a cup of tea growing cold on the table beside her. Maya the cat was curled on the windowsill, the city lights blinking beyond the glass. Olivia stared at a message she hadn't answered, a personal invitation from the Attorney General herself to join the state's Housing Advisory Board. It should have felt like a triumph, a culmination. Instead, it felt heavy. Marcus had said something the other day, something small, but it lingered. You're not just a lawyer anymore. Liv, you are a symbol. People see you and think, maybe justice can show up looking like us. That's power. And power doesn't come with time off. She wasn't sure she wanted that either. The next morning, she returned to Riverside Gardens not as a lawyer, not with papers, but just as Olivia. She walked the perimeter with Gloria, pausing every few feet as neighbors waved from their windows. The sky was overcast, but the garden was in bloom again. Yellow marigolds, deep purple petunias, and vines climbing slowly up the old wrought iron fence. They're saying your name at City Hall now, Gloria said softly. I know. They're scared of you. I don't want them to be scared, Olivia said. I want them to change. Gloria looked at her. You didn't ask for this war, Olivia. But you're winning it, and I don't think it ends with us. A pause. You ever think maybe the system didn't just need a lawyer, it needed a witness? That night, Olivia finally responded to the Attorney General, not to accept a seat on the board, but to propose something else. It's an independent oversight coalition led by community advocates and legal scholars, not politicians, a structure that outlives any one attorney, something that lasts. The reply came quickly. Let's talk. And Olivia knew then this wasn't the end of the case. It wasn't even the end of the beginning. The law was still the tool, but now she was building something larger. Not a courtroom victory, a blueprint. 3 months later, the first brick came down not from Riverside Gardens, but from the downtown office building that once housed the city's infamous Office 14B, a quiet city contract reorganization, buried under layers of municipal jargon, had led to its dissolution. No press release, no public apology, just a line in the city's budget summary, restructuring of non-compliant permitting divisions. But everyone who'd been watching knew, and everyone knew why. The investigation into Westlake development had expanded rapidly, spearheaded by a newly formed task force operating independently from city influence, just as Olivia had proposed. The task force had subpoenaed internal emails, reviewed payment trails, uncovered ghost-written inspection reports, and even a slush fund managed under a community outreach shell account. Lawsuits multiplied. Class actions followed. Other communities, long displaced and long silenced, began coming forward. One case in Roxbury, another in Dorchester. Olivia wasn't involved in all of them. She couldn't be, but her name hovered over each, like a permission slip from justice itself. But the most important victory hadn't come from courtrooms or headlines. It came one quiet Thursday morning when Gloria Winters opened her mailbox and found a stamped envelope from the Massachusetts Land Preservation Authority. She held it in trembling hands and walked slowly across the courtyard to Olivia, who was sipping coffee beneath the old magnolia tree near Building C. They approved it, Gloria said, voice cracking. Olivia stood, the designation. Gloria nodded, eyes welling. Riverside Gardens is now officially registered as a protected historical community. Olivia didn't speak at first. She just closed her eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle in her bones. Then she smiled, not the public smile she wore for cameras or reporters, but the kind that belonged to something earned. I'll make sure the plaque's beautiful. Olivia said. No, Gloria replied, reaching out to take her hand. You'll help us make it. The ceremony took place in early autumn. The air had started to cool, and the sky held the kind of pale blue that made even old buildings look new. A podium had been set up at the center of the courtyard, surrounded by folding chairs, flower arrangements, and banners painted by the neighborhood children. One read, "Our home is history." Olivia didn't speak that day. She stood to the side, letting Gloria lead the speeches, letting other residents tell their stories. She'd spoken enough. Now it was time to listen. The mayor showed up, unannounced, and sat quietly into the third row. A few council members came too, but no one asked them to speak. This moment didn't belong to them. As the final ribbon was cut, revealing a bronze plaque set into the garden wall, Gloria turned to Olivia and whispered, "You built something here." "You know." Olivia shook her head. "We built it. I just reminded the system what it forgot." Gloria laughed, still humble, even now. "I'm a lawyer," Olivia said with a small shrug. "We don't get statues, but maybe," Gloria said softly, "we get gardens." Later that evening, after the chairs were folded and the crowd had dispersed, Olivia lingered near the plaque. The garden smelled of earth and warmth. The marigolds had bloomed again. She didn't know how long she stood there before she heard footsteps behind her. "Counselor," a familiar voice said. She turned. Judge Coleman stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. No robe today, just a gray coat and a quietly humbled presence. "You made it," she said. "I wasn't invited." "You didn't need to be." They stood in silence for a beat. Then he nodded toward the plaque. "You know, I've presided over thousands of cases, seen lawyers rise and fall, but I don't think I've ever seen someone rewrite the courtroom without changing a single law. It's not the laws that needed rewriting," Olivia said. "It was how we used them, who we saw when we used them." Coleman looked away, as if embarrassed. "I was wrong about you. You were wrong about a lot of us." He winced, but didn't deflect. "That's what I've been trying to change. Quietly, I've reopened 6 cases I presided over in the past decade, ordered external reviews." Olivia blinked. That's something. "I also teach now," he added, almost sheepishly, "adjunct, judicial bias and structural reform. I use your case every semester." Olivia smiled. "Do they know you're the judge in the story?" He chuckled. "Not at first." They stood again in silence. Finally, Coleman spoke. "What are you going to do now? There's talk of a run for office. The AG wants you on the commission. I'm sure you've had offers from every firm this side of the Mississippi." "I've had offers," Olivia admitted, "but I don't want a corner office. And I don't want to be another lawyer who disappeared after the headline." "What do you want?" She looked out across the garden, then up at the building facades, weathered and proud. "I want to teach, build something from the inside out. Train people who look like me, who come from where I come from, and show them that the system is only as broken as the people who refuse to fix it." Coleman nodded. "Then maybe there's hope for Petit." She turned to him. "Not maybe. There has to be." 1 year later, Olivia stood at the front of a classroom at Boston's Community Legal Academy, a program she helped design, focused on practical law, ethics, and advocacy for underserved communities. Her students were young, hungry, and far from perfect. They asked questions that didn't have clean answers. They challenged her, and she welcomed every second of it. That afternoon, she ended class with the same story she always did on the final day. Not about her victory, but about the silence before it, the moment she stood in that courtroom and chose not to correct the judge's assumptions. People will underestimate you, she told them. Sometimes it's a weapon, sometimes it's a gift, but it's never a reason to shrink. A student raised her hand. What if we try and still fail? Olivia smiled. Then you try again and again. Because the system counts on your exhaustion. Don't give it what it wants. As the bell rang and the students filed out, Olivia returned to her desk. A single envelope waited for her, no return address. Inside was a small note, handwritten. I see now. Thank you for showing me how. AC. She folded it once, placed it gently in her drawer, and turned off the light. Outside, Boston hummed on imperfect, striving, unfinished, but somewhere in its corners, a garden bloomed. And justice, at last, had roots.